human rights issues and challenges in Northeast India, organized by this, Center for Ethnic Studies and Research in collaboration with Department of Political Science, Moridul College, Dhemaji, and Department of Political Science, Morigaon College, Morigaon. And in this technical session, Professor Rudra Pradhan, Associate Professor, School of Humanities from Goa Beach Pilani campus, he will be joining as a speaker for this session. Before starting our technical session, let me record your verbal attendance, which is very mandatory for successful completion of the program. I would like to request. Now, I would like to request. Dr. Vijay Krishna Nath sir, please switch off your speaker. Jasavan Narayan, please switch off your speaker. Okay, let's start. So again, I'm telling you friends, so here you see in this technical session, Professor Rudra Pradhan sir is with us. So now I'd like to request our advisor, Honorable Josna Hazarika Madam, to initiate the session and introduce our speaker, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Deepandas. Namaskar. Good morning to all the respected participants present in this day 5 technical session 11th. Dr. R.P. Pradhan, Associate Professor, Department of Humanities and Social Science, BITS Pilani Goa campus, is present among us this morning. His topic of deliberation is Human Rights, Education, Research and Application, a Case Study of India. Before his lecture, may I introduce Dr. R.P. Pradhan, the multi-talented academician who is present among us this morning, and we are fortunate enough having you here, sir. Before joining BITS Pilani Goa campus, R.P. Pradhan worked as a program manager, the International Center, Goa, for over 9 years. Dr. Pradhan played a number of critical academic roles in International Center, Goa. He had a number of major contributions at ICG, and ICG bestowed Excellent Performance Award to him in recognition of his service in the year 2004. He also served as a member of the Board of Trustees of ICG during 2008 to 2012. He is serving at BITS Pilani, KK Birla Goa campus from 2004 August onwards. His academic institutional roles are, as a Distinguished Fellow, he was invited to serve as Distinguished Fellow at Center for Public Policy Research, Kerala. He is a member of Board of Studies in Geography, Goa University. He is also a Senior Associate Editor in interdisciplinary online journal titled Social Science Research, published by North Lakhimpur College Autonomous. He is also a member of Society for Terrorism Research, United Kingdom. He also acquired Commonwealth Fellowship, Member Expert for Economic Commonwealth Fellowship, MSc and PhD program, Ministry of Human Resource Development, Government of India. He also acquired Israel Government Fellowship as a Member Expert for Economics for Masters and PhD programs, Ministry of Human Resource Development, Government of India, 2008. He is also a member of Board of Studies, Center for Latin American Studies, Goa University. He is also the member of Board of Trustees, which is the highest decision-making body. Embassy of Panama, New Delhi, 1997, awarded at FICCI, New Delhi. Dr. Pradhan, his area of publications are unlimited. I have just collected a few numbers of his publication. He is a regular author of Mainstream Weekly, in which 10 members of volumes are selected as recent publication. Around 7 numbers of books are published as a book chapters. Dr. Pradhan is also the editor of a number of books. Coastal Zone Management of Goa, the International Center Goa 1998 is one of his specific edited books. He is also Goa Maritime Dialogue YouTube lecturer. He presented quite a large number of papers in both national and international level as well. So now, may I request you, sir, to be on the dais of this virtual platform and deliver your valuable lecture on your topic, Human Rights Education, Research and Application, the Case Study of India. Now it's over to you, sir. A very good morning.
Thank you. May I start? Am I audible?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. You can start.
Sir, Pradhan sir, please give me just 1 second. So there is an announcement for all the participants that our honorable observer from ICSSR NERC is here with the program to monitor all the sessions. So I request all the participants to switch on your video. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Now you can proceed.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you very much at the outset for inviting me. I think I must congratulate Center for Ethnic Studies and Research, Tezpur, Guwahati, for organizing this capacity building or awareness creating sessions for issues of human rights or understanding of human rights issues and the education pertaining to human rights issues, research and application of all of that. I think this is a good exercise where I can see such a lot of participants from all across northeastern states have joined to be part of these deliberations. Human rights, by and large, is critically economics linked, and corresponding to the state of economic development, the sense and the consciousness of human rights also rises. That as I go along, we'll talk about it. So at the beginning, let me thank Dr. Dipen Saikia, chairperson, Dr. Dipen Das, organizing secretary, and Dr. Joseph Dias, coordinator. And I was told that the ICSSR observer is also present here. So thank you for inviting me for this deliberation. I'm sure that this is the fifth session of the series, so I'm sure that a lot of deliberations have already gone in, and many of you must have really enriched yourself in the process of various aspects or facets of human rights understanding and its application. My topic today is human rights education, research and application, case of India. Now, as far as the case of India is concerned, I think all of us, we are academics, we come from the academic background. So more or less, we have a rough sketch of where India stands in terms of human rights issues and concerns. But nevertheless, from the beginning itself, I would like to clarify that there is a lot of rhetoric both in India and outside about human rights. Its application, its uses, abuses, all of that are a great matter of concern in the international scenario. And inside India, if we look at it also, it is a great debate. But one has to be a little careful in trying to understand the issues of human rights and the rhetoric around the issues of human rights. Very often we have plenty of protesters who join to protest everything. And it is not necessarily that the protesters are right. Very often they're also motivated, they're also funded, there are also many other ways, they're also promoted to stage a protest. So that's where I think academics, we stand at a crossroad, we stand at a responsible role to examine what should we consume or what should we filter out, or how should we appreciate the whole orientation of human rights issues and its rhetorics. And rising country like India, we have a greater role to do so, largely because India at this juncture today, 2021, we are in August, and we are also the Security Council chairperson. India is chairing the Security Council council today for the month of August. So we have both at the international level and at the internal level, at the domestic level and at the hinterland level, we are all being watched. Rising India is a matter of observation for many people, both inside and outside. China is watching, the Americans are watching, the Britishers are watching, Taiwan is also watching, Tibet is also watching, Japanese are watching, Australians want India to play a big role. Africa has always looked at India as a peace power. And within the country itself, many of us, we have great emotional involvement in terms of the rise of India as a phenomena. So that's where actually I'll pitch and try and create a balance between the narrative of human rights issues, the rhetoric, and the practice of human rights. How is it being staged in India in the global context? So we have to create a context for that, and that's where my lecture is all about. Now, to set the stage, I have picked up a few stories to begin with. Few very interesting stories in classroom, in colleges, as faculties. We tell many instances, empirical evidences, and many ways to carry across our point of view. Here, I'm trying to, all of us, we are from different background. I think largely majority must have been from the political science branch. These stories will facilitate to set the stage. They're all global stories, and that's where they will set the stage for a clearer understanding or creating a good context. Some time ago, I wrote an article, and the title of the article was Christmas Diplomacy, Peace, Prejudice, and Pride. So Christmas Diplomacy, if you Google, you will get my article also. It was published in Mainstream. And that is a collection of stories all around the world pertaining to the day of Christmas as it is being celebrated and what happened around the world. I have not mentioned in the article about the celebrations that happened, but the most spectacular alternative things that have happened on the occasion of Christmas, that's been the focus of that story. So two of these article stories, let me share with you. There's a movie called Joyeux Noël. Joyeux Noël is a French term, means Merry Christmas. So Merry Christmas, I think while the Christians celebrate it in a great way, I think everybody in the world knows the significance of Christmas, and Merry Christmas goes with that. Now, Christmas, given the Christian population in the world, I think Christmas is a very, very, very widely celebrated occasion all over the world. And it symbolizes peace, brotherhood, and many such issues. Now, it was 1914, December 24th. And when we say 1914, December 24th, that means First World War has already started for the last over 6 months. Now, August 1914, First World War started. And I'm talking about the incident that happened on 24th December 1914. Europe is all charged up for the war. It's all war ongoing. And war means the laws of state are immaterial. It is like people are assigned to kill and create victory for their own country. And on the border, the particularly Western Front border in the European continent, where the peak of the war is taking place, then the evening of 24th December 1914 arrives. And all of us, we know that there's a midnight mass that happens on the 24th December midnight. And as the evening progresses, border, people are all country-wide, soldiers are all stationed with their trenches, with their all kinds of war machinations to kill the other side. They're all ready, and till evening they were fighting. trying to kill the other, create victory for themselves. But as the evening progresses, soldiers across the border, they also felt that the Christmas is arriving. And Pope at the time had appealed to the world conscience and the warring countries that please, Christmas is arriving, please allow a day of peace. But officially, none of the countries would like to say that yes, we have an official truce. None of them they agreed. But as things would happen on the border itself, all the rival soldiers, they started singing Christmas jingles. And as it started progressing the evening, they started exchanging whatever sweetmeats they had, and joining with the singing of the Christmas carol and all that. All of them started doing it together. Rival soldiers, be the French, the German, the British, and all of them, Belgium, Luxembourg, and all of that, they came out from the trench and started joining the singing together. They're all, till the evening they were fighting, trying to kill the other. But now the Christmas, climate, it recreated the conditions. The war scenario, the war ambassadors, the soldiers, loaded fully, and they started singing the Christmas, carols. Soon after, they exchanged gifts also, and next day they had a football match. And at the headquarters, army headquarters, none of their superiors, commanders, and all of them, they appreciated that the soldiers are defying their orders and observing what you call a natural truce and joining with the enemy camps, soldiers, and all that. What happened? Christmas arrived, and in spite of the soldiers being trained to kill the other, create victory for their own country, they also recognize the sanctity of Christmas and join together with the enemies to celebrate the event of Christmas. That's World War I. The point here I'm trying to say is that there is an official position of rivalry. There's an official position of bravery. There's an official position of how should you project yourself when you are dealing with the enemy countries and all of that. But there's a level of humanity that remains at the core of all of us, whether we are soldiers, teachers, doctors, or anything that we are, but we are a human being. At the core of all of us, we are a human being first, and we respond to the human emotions that are available at a given time. And that's what the soldiers, the warring soldiers, the enemy soldiers, they displayed there. That's 1914. That means World War I. This is they played football, they exchanged gifts, and started singing, drinking together, and all of that. That's one aspect of the humanity being displayed by the soldiers of war. Now I come to Second World War. Now, Second World War, it also continued for 5 years. And the commanders and the governments and all of them, they were aware that Christmas every year, it will approach, and the religious bodies will appeal for peace and all of that. So they had a strict, governmental stricture that the soldiers must avoid Christmas celebrations with the opponent camp, with the opposite enemy soldiers and all of that. But it, very few instances of Second World War soldiers participating in the Christmas that I note. There's a very strange thing that happened. I'm talking about 1944, December 24th. So that means 30 years later after the First World War, 1944. Second World War is at the peak of its fight. The Germans have started assaulting then the losing ground. They have started their last final assault to regain what they had lost by that time. The Americans have joined the war. And again, December 24, 1944 comes. There's a location called Ardennes Forest. Ardennes Forest is located in the tri-junction of Luxembourg, Belgium, and France. And it is partly German territory. And the story pertains to a small German family. The man of the house, he was been assigned civil defense responsibility. So he is on the war front. The family had a city house, but the cities were the casualty, lots of bombing and all that. And so they left for a small forest, that forest, Ardennes Forest, and they had a small cottage in the forest. So the family, the man thought that the wife and the child will be safe in the forest, where lesser attention will be given to the forest areas. So for safety reasons, they shifted to the forest cottage. Man is in the war front, and the lady's name is Elizabeth Winken. You can Google it and find out also. And the lady and her 12-year-old son, Fritz, they were there in the house. And somewhere around 9 o'clock in the night, it's complete pitch dark. It's jungle, it's forest area. They had a minimal light. Lights were also not allowed because it becomes the enemy soldiers can spot you, and correspondingly you may become the target. So you had to have the minimum lighting and all that. So the family, the mother and son, they are preparing for the evening dinner, and then suddenly they heard a knock in their house. It's deep inside the forest, and suddenly knock. The lady was very afraid that it could be anybody, and maybe possibly they're facing death. So they, whatever minimal light they had, they switched off, put it off, and very frightenedly, almost paralyzed with fear, the lady opened the door. She saw that 3 soldiers were standing, steel helmeted soldiers were standing, 4 of them, they were standing there. And the lady asked them in German, this is a German lady, the territory belongs to Germany. It's a tri-junction of Luxembourg, France, Germany, and Belgium. And she asked them in German language, who you are. And the response was in English. The soldiers responded to her in English, and they were trying to say something. The lady instantly realized that these are not German soldiers. They were trying to speak English, and the lady couldn't understand what they're trying to, but quickly she realized that they are the American soldiers. They are standing there. 3 of them, they were in the front, and one of them was nearly bundled, wounded, and he was lying on the snow, bleeding profusely. And through communication, through whatever means, language was a barrier, so through whatever means, the soldiers tried to tell her that, can you have shelter in your house for the night? They just politely asked if at all they can stay in the night. They were fully loaded, armed soldiers. They could have forced their entry into the house. They didn't do that. Rather, they asked for her permission to stay in the house for the night. The lady didn't know what to do. American soldiers, a German lady, land is in Germany, and if at all you are known, or somebody comes to know that you have given asylum or shelter to the American soldier, then you are killed. It will be considered as high treason. So death penalty is the minimum penalty that one would get. So the lady didn't have any choice, and when finally, politely, she saw that the soldier that is lying there is looking more dead than alive, and said, and the soldiers, somehow they communicated that they have been wandering all over the forest. They lost their way from their contingent, from the fellow American soldiers, and lost their way. For the last 2 days, they have been wandering around, they're hungry, and they are wounded also, and if at all they can take shelter. So lady reluctantly finally allowed them, and then was giving basic medical aid to the wounded soldier, and was trying to give them some food. That's 24th December night. Christmas is approaching, and war is also there. Climate is like that. And then as 3 American soldiers and the mother Elizabeth Winken and the child Fritz, they were there. They heard another knock in the door. The lady, initially thought that maybe some more American soldiers, they have strayed their way, so they might be knocking the door. So she, opened the door. This time, she was frightened to see that German soldiers are there right in front of her. 3 German soldiers. So she quickly recognized that these are all German soldiers. They're fighting for her country. And they exchanged in German language, they exchanged greetings and Merry Christmas, whatever. And then they asked, they are hungry and lost their way. And can they take shelter for the night in her house? Now you imagine war is going on. The lady and her son, 3 American soldiers are already inside the house, and this time it was 4 German soldiers. They were there. And the lady, with all her fear and all of that, she said, after the initial greetings and all that, she said, "Well, you are welcome, but there are some more people in my house whom you may not consider as your friends." So the German team leader, the commander, became suddenly stern and demanded to know who are there inside your house. She said, "Well, they are all soldiers, and they could be Americans, and like you are, like my son, they also could be the son of their mothers. They had lost their way. One of them is badly injured. And this is Christmas evening. Let us not kill each other. Can we celebrate Christmas or have food together, the Americans and the German soldiers?" Finally, there's a lot of silence, and you can understand the depth of the scenario. And finally, the German soldiers agreed, and they came inside. Strange it may sound, but wartime, Second World War, that too, ferocious, and 4 German soldiers, 3 American soldiers, they stayed in that house, took shelter in that house in the jungle, and had food together. Next morning, when they were departing, the German soldiers tried to explain to the American soldiers how should they go so that they avoid the German soldiers' attention. Now, friends, there is an official position, and this story actually came from the son himself, Fritz, when he grows up, and that's where 1973 this story was first time published, and I got it, so I have written about this also. Now imagine we have a India, Pakistan, we have a kind of a engagement. All of us, we are familiar that we very often, whether we have ever met a Pakistani or not, we have a kind of a emotional outburst against Pakistan, as though all the people of Pakistan are bad. And we have a similar kind of a narrative from the Pakistani side also. We share enmity, but we have also plenty of instances where both mutually have been great friends and great, they have been useful to each other in many, many ways. So there's an official position versus there's a human being in all of us, that we, at the core of our heart, we have reason, rationality, and sense of belonging to a society, to where we express ourselves in variety of ways. These are all extraordinary, private, sense of humanity being displayed, and this is unparalleled in history of this kind of a thing. You ask the German ambassador or the American ambassadors, they will look for the blood of the other, but then at the private level, the lady in a remote forest in Germany is sheltering the Germans and the Americans together, and all are wartime, that too. That's where we have to appreciate the context of human rights in variety of ways. There's a legal right, there's a political narrative, there's an economic condition, and there's a climate in which all these rights and privileges are being exercised. So that's where it is necessary that we set the stage. There are two stories I talked about. Then I'll talk about a third story, which will also explain in greater detail as to how do we understand it. Third one pertains to the Native Americans before the United States was formed. I'm talking about 1776. United States is now been independent. George Washington has been chosen to be the leader. And there were Native Americans, what we call as Amerindians, or what you call, all of you have seen movies, of the Native Americans. And today, if at all you look at Native Americans, they're roughly around 200,000 in number. And like Northeastern state, they enjoy a special status in the American territory and law also. You cannot buy their land, and they're protected. They're endangered species, 200,000, 2 lakhs only remaining. And what has happened to the others? They have been encroached upon. They have been taken over by the Americans, the modernity, civilization, and the modern nation state that we call. They have been taken over. Their land, resources, everything. So now, 1776, George Washington has come to power, and George Washington's son-in-law goes to talk to the tribal leaders of the Native Americans, saying that now we are the modern nation state, the United States of America, and you have to join with us, and we create a nation together. So George Washington's son-in-law goes to talk to the tribal leaders, and the dialogue between the tribal leaders and George Washington's son-in-law, or who is representing the American modern government, that dialogue is very critical. He goes to tell that, look, I have been assigned the responsibility by the state to talk to you, that you surrender to us, you submit to us, and we will give you security, we will give you political status, and you become part of us. You surrender to us, you submit yourself to us. So the submission is the condition on which the political status of the Native Indians, they are called Native Indians, or Amerindians we call them also. That depends. That dependent on their submission. They say, if you give us whatever you have and you become part of us, we will protect you. Now, the tribals, they never knew what is a modern state. They don't know what is laws or traditions, nothing of that kind. They have been living at state of nature. So they have, respected the trees. They have respected or shaped the mountains. They have been using the waters of the stream. The birds and the animals have been part of their climate, part of their surrounding and life. So they have never ever thought that there is something where we can submit, surrender, or share it with. So the next day there was a function in which the tribal leader is trying to tell the local fellows. Local fellows are wondering what is happening. What is this fellow is trying to tell us? What do we, So the tribal leader, who seemed to be little more, conscious of things, he is in a function, he is trying to tell the local tribals that this is what is the development and this is what we are supposed to be doing. Now he's trying to tell that, look, we have been living here for centuries, for ages, but now the times have changed. Now it is the United States of America. It's a new country, and they don't understand what a country means. If you go to Pakistan and the Pakhtun area, the tribal leaders, they don't understand Islamabad. They don't understand constitution. They do not understand your Prime Minister Imran Khan. It's like we have a tribal culture, heritage. We live peacefully within the space of our territory. And who are you to tell us if there is a constitution of Pakistan? There in Pakistan, Pakhtun area, if at all, or the Afghan-Pakistan border area, if you look at it, the tribals, they have a culture, and profile themselves, and they don't understand your modern complexities of constitution, political rights, judiciary, Islamabad, and the orders of the government. They don't understand what a government is. So the tribal leader is trying to communicate to the fellow fellow men, saying that, look, the American government is referring to them as my father. My father, they are very kind to us. They're saying that sell whatever you have to us. They wanted to have a treaty, sell whatever, surrender, submit to the United States, and United States becomes the guarantor of your safety, security, and property. We have to sell them so that they will protect us. And then he's trying to clarify, and the fellows asked, tribal fellows, they asked, what do we sell? He says, well, we never knew that we ever own anything. These trees, the mountains, the river, or the waters of the river, the croaking of the frogs, the chirping of the birds, we never knew that we ever owned them. But then they're telling that we must sell them so that we become part of their society and they protect us. That's where I think the complications of modern understanding begins. We have tried to sell many things that we never own. The territory, the land, the trees, the cows, the buffaloes, the many things. And then we have created a political profile around that called a country. And then we have created many institutions around that and trying to say that, my country, how dare you encroach into? And we have a great rivalry, great wars, and great amount of killing and great amount of narrative on human rights. We kill and then use machines of killing and then talk about human rights, that we must respect each other, we must value each other. And that's where I think if we look at the narratives, that the stories that we talk about, individual level, Hobbes, Thomas Hobbes is talking about that life in jungle was nasty, brutish, and barbaric. Security was not there. But then John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau do not agree with the Hobbesian approach, that life in a state of nature was bad, nasty, brutish, and there's no security. They don't agree. So it is a matter of debate that whether laws of nature are, have been friendly. There have been occasions of war and all that also, that is there. But then state of nature, as we see them today or understand them, they have been, possibly they have been far more friendly to each other. The ecosystem itself is, was a cohesive existence. Now, the story is actually set the background that we have created modernity, we have created civilizational, we have created a value system, and then we're trying to say that we have to protect the human rights. And in order to ensure that we protect human rights, millions are being killed. Be it the wars, be it COVID, be it Pakistan, Afghanistan, and all of that. If we look at it, Syria, all of that, we look at it, that is, unfortunately, we are trying to respect human rights, understand human rights as political scientists, as legal experts, and all of that. And in order to do so, we have no choice but to kill people so that we can protect them. That's the irony. That's the controversy. That's the contradiction of human rights narratives and all that. How does India negotiate into a climate of this kind of a rhetoric, this kind of a narrative? If I look back, I think India, largely India is referred as a civilizational state. Very often, all of you might see many narratives saying that India is a civilizational state. Egyptians were a civilizational state. China is a civilizational state. Whereas the Americans, the state itself, they're all migrants from everywhere, from Africa, from Europe, from Latin America, from everywhere. And it is a commercial state. It is a profit-centric state. It's not a civilized, it's just 400 years old or 500 years old. And then prior to that, is the Native Americans who were told that you submit and then we will protect you. And they had to sell, the Native Americans had to sell the mountain, which never they owned, and the animals, the trees, and the fresh air and all of that. We are called a civilizational state. Why? It's largely because if you look at it, the existence of India has been, it is not a debate. It is antiquity. It's a pretty old civilization. That's the only civilization that is surviving. The Egyptian civilization is lost. The number of other civilizations, Mayans, Aztecs, and Incas, all of them have been lost. But India, it's like a river flow, and it continues to flow, and we are referred as a civilizational state. And that's where I will refer to one of the former director of London School of Economics, Halford John Mackinder. Halford John Mackinder was the second director of London School of Economics. And when the Second World War was going on, Mackinder has given some theories pertaining to the maritime sector. Those who are working, they must be knowing very well. Mackinder's theory is that it's a heartland theory, it is called. But 1943, there was a magazine that asked Mackinder, saying that in your young days, you wrote theories. And today, after so many years, you are, he was 83 years old in 1943. And can you write and say, in the midst of this war, can you anticipate what's going to happen in the future? And a very interesting quote, I quote, Mackinder is talking about, saying that the monsoon lands of India and China, they will rise. Mind you, Mackinder wrote this article in 1943. He was 83 years old man, geographer by profession, has talked about heartland theory, and even today, very extensively, Strait of Hormuz or Gulf of Aden or Suez area or the Indo-Pacific area, Indian Ocean. These are his connotations. These are his terminologies being used. And he's saying that the monsoon lands of India and China, they will rise to power with their civilizational value, and 1,000 million people, they will then balance the remaining 1,000 million people living between Missouri. Missouri is a river in US, between Missouri and the Yangtze River. Yangtze River is not in the China, it's in Russia, St. Petersburg, around that. That means number of things he's talking about. 1943, mind you, he's saying that India and China, they will rise to prominence, and with their civilizational value order and their 1,000 million people, they will then balance the remaining 1,000 million people living in the world, and the world will be happier with its because balanced, and that's why world order will be better. Today, as we stand today, it is not that the United Nations Security Council that India is chairing, and or we are playing a larger role. If we see, the Chinese are rising, and they have created an international disruption of the international order. The Americans are wanting to contain China, so that also is creating anxiety of war. The Russians want to a critical, powerful role. That is also creating anxiety. We're all in the threshold of war. What Graham Allison, Harvard professor, is a pretty old man. He talked about the concept of Thucydides trap, that when a new power rises, there is a possibility of war, and that's what is being referred, Thucydides trap, as being referred as the rise of China, and the Americans will not allow the China to grow, so there is a war coming up. But in between the entire transition and the surcharged political atmosphere, coronavirus, 4 million people already being dead, which power in the world is the peace power? It's India, and peace power means credible peace power. I mean, not wanting to have peace. You have to have the credibility to ensure peace is there. India is the balancing power today. India is the peace power today. We are between the Chinese and the Americans and the Russians and trying to negotiate if at all there's a possibility, there's a prospect for peace and all that. And that's why number of American scholars also call India as a swing state. India, Turkey, Indonesia, Brazil, they're all called as a swing state. And India is the most prominent swing state among all of them. It's because it's a large market. So global interest is bound to be there. People will be more interested in India to come and trade. We buy somewhere around 15 million mobiles every month. Similar number of televisions we buy per annum. It's a large market. That's what Mackinder referred in his 1943 observation, saying that they will rise with 1,000 million people. So we have and what we have produced historically, or how did we deal with the issue of human rights as far as India as a civilizational state is concerned? Ramayana and Mahabharata, I think, are the two of the iconic literature India produces. And Ramayana talks about good governance. And if you have good governance, the issues of human rights doesn't exist. It's not necessary. You don't have to waste your time on writing on human rights. When there is malgovernance, well, there is the governing establishment overuses their ability of governance, then there is human rights issues and concerns, and that's where. And Mahabharata, the other side of it, it is a narrative of, if at all the ruling establishment violates or goes away outside the excesses, the mandate that is entrusted on them, then there is the civilizational response of war to set it right. And that's where, be it Ramayana or Mahabharata, or the tradition of India, like Islam came to India at a point of time, the Parsis came to India, and all of them, they used India, came, stayed here, and got acculturated. They're all part of the Indian heritage. And we have a Taj Mahal, we have a Tatas, we have a Dorabji, and many such instances. They came here, stayed here, some of them in the process of conquering, but then they got conquered themselves, stayed on, and they are part of the narrative itself. So where did we start with the narrative of human rights? Our interaction with issues or idea of human rights comes only when we first time interacted with the European colonizers, the Britishers and the French and the Dutch and all of them, they came, and then they felt that we are all natives, under-civilized, and that's why we have to be civilized to the ideas of rights, liberties, justice, and all of that. And that's where they thought that it is their responsibility that they have to talk to the Africans, Latin Americans, or Asians about what is right, what is law, what is justice, what is jurisprudence, and all of them. And we are happily, our education process has helped us to happily drop big names, Huxley, Rousseau, and all of that, and many other names that, and that's where we have a embedded confusion into the idea of what human rights stands for and how should we deal with. And periodically the Americans, the Britishers, and all of them, those who talk about those who have violated the human rights, the maximum, they tell us that, look, your country, your government, be it BJP, be it Congress, or any other government for that matter, is not doing it enough. They have to do it much, much better. But we have lived for centuries a life of humanity or humanism that was part of the cultural process. When the Parsis came to India, they landed in Gujarat coast, and apparently, as the narrative goes, the local king, he said, no, we have enough people and we cannot accommodate you. And apparently, as the story would go, the Maharaja in the Gujarat coast and local place, some small place, Maharaja ordered for a glass of milk. And he says, look, the glass is already full with milk. How do I keep more milk in that? Apparently, the Parsis who had come from Iran, that area, under the pressure of religious persecution, one of them, he took out a spoonful of sugar and he put it in the milk. And he says, well, you have the population, you have the milk, we will sweeten it. And that's where Tatas, the Parsis have value added, and many such contributions have happened. We have lived centuries of civilizational value called humanity, and that's where Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam has been the internal narrative of India, and that's where we need not have to necessarily learn at European jargons of human rights and all that. Rather, we have to look at it at a much greater, much more efficient way from the Indian point of view. Now, there's a very strange and great narrative that is also emerging, saying that as China is rising, it is a fact. All of us, we are feeling the pinch of it, and particularly northeastern state, all of you have greater exposure, and Arunachal in particular has a lot of concerns. And when China is rising, and the Americans are wanting to dominate and recreate, the Japanese and the Indians are joining together, and we are trying to create a world order which will be more peaceful and all that. Now, it is in that context, if at all we look at India, we're the only peace power in the country who's a nuclear power also, but talks peace. We're not a poor power. We're a credible power. We are a nuclear power also. We can efficiently display our nuclear ability and all of that. And yet we talk of peace. And that's where now I think world has to learn about India, its value system, and many other formats of narratives around the human rights and all that. Modern human rights, after much of the killings and all that happened in the First World War, Second World War, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and all of that. I think all of you are familiar that 10th December, we celebrate as the Human Rights Day, World Human Rights Day, and that's also the day when United Nations Human Rights Prize is also being distributed, and the Nobel Peace Prize is also distributed on the same day, and what we call the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, now adopted by the United Nations on 10th December 1948. That becomes the modern format. So when from the Indian point of view, whenever we are trying to look at the whole idea of human rights, we have to definitely connect ourselves to the past in which India has behaved. There's a very interesting empirical evidence of how India has behaved politically and economically and all of that. The political scientists and economists present here, I will encourage all of you to look at. There is a data set available from Angus Madison. Angus Madison is a British economist, and he has brilliantly captured the economic profile of the world from the day one. Day one means when we say first millennia. Now, when the agricultural economics begins, and what was the economic profile, who produced for the world and all of that. So Angus Madison's data set, if I look at it, from day one till 1820s, India and China together, they produced close to 60% of world's productivity. What we in modern terms call it a GDP. 60% of world's GDP that came from India and China put together. The remaining 200 countries that we have today, they were not in this present form, but they were there. They produced the remaining 40% of the world's productivity. India's steel industry, shipping industry, textile industry. All of you are more exposed to textile industry in northeastern states. We had the global prominence and dominance in that. The Britishers came, killed systematically all of that, and then started talking about you should be civilized. So whenever we are writing from India, we're talking about the international human rights issues and concerns and all of that. We have to certainly, the beginning of eruption or disruption happens only when we first encountered with the Europeans. And mind you, India was trading with Italy and east coast of Africa from 1st century, 2nd century, 3rd century BC. Maritime trading was happening up to north of Egypt and Italy and the European markets, and that's what spice trade was. And the spice trade only carried spice and its prosperity, the profit. It never carried war. But when the Europeans came, the whole narrative became different. They wanted colonies, they wanted domination, they wanted subordination. And that's where the next 300 years of history, global history, is distorted. And today we are told that human rights in India is not in a good condition, and your Transparency International and number of institutions, they say that your conditions are not good. So we have a history, we have a background, we have a culture, we have a civilizational profile, and that's where I think its time has come where India has to take the lead. And that's where when we debate, very often we tell that the Westphalian time frame is over. What is Westphalia? 1648. The European countries, after fighting with each other, finally they came to Westphalia. This is a small place in North Germany, 3 hours from Amsterdam. If you travel, it's a wonderful place to travel to. Westphalia, they all sat down together and then had the Westphalia Treaty, saying that we are tired, we have fought enough, now we must have peace among ourselves. Westphalia Treaty 1648, first time created a condition which delivered relative peace to Europe for the next 200 years. So Westphalia, and after that, when you see modern formation of nation states, Westphalia is the guiding principle, guiding framework of modern nation states. And the Europeans, through their institutions, Westphalia and many other institutions and rules and regulations, they say that Westphalia has been a better format of governance, and law, right, and liberty, all of that is being given than the natives. Now the narrative is that Westphalia time is over. Now it is Asia is rising, and it is Eastphalia has to be written. There's no place called Eastphalia, but that's an alternative narrative that time for Eastphalia has come in. Countries like India, who represent the civilizational process, they have to guide the narrative or the corridor of engagement in the international space. So today, rhetorically we have gone far ahead, and as far as human rights concerns are concerned, we have also added COVID-19 concerns and casualties into that. Then we are also talking about sustainable development goals, climate change, cyber, digital technology, and democracy, inequality, peace, and security, poverty, and development. All these issues have been incorporated into India, into the whole plethora of human rights issues and concerns all over India. And now, when you talk of the modern narrative, let me wrap it up, is that 1948, we have a slogan statement taken at the United Nations, and then Article 1st of the Declaration says that all human beings are free and equal in dignity and rights. That's what is a recognition that and the Article 3rd, life, liberty, and right to security of persons are basic rights upon which any other right that may have to be there is dependent. That means right to life, liberty, and right to security. That means the human being at the core is the primary debate. He or she has to be protected. Now, the same approach has been adopted into India in our practice of human rights. Now, in the modern state, everything gets monitored. So we have to also create a conformity to the international standards. And that's where 1993, what you call our Human Rights Rights Act, Protection of Human Rights Act 1993, becomes one of the prominent guidelines as far as India is concerned. And in Section 2D of the 1993 Act, that it provides a constitutional status to the idea of human rights as far as India is concerned, and it guarantees not only constitutional, also the judicial response is also available. Theoretically, if you look at it, there are several ways in which you can look at human rights issues. legal right theory, then you have natural rights theory, then you have idealistic theory, historical theory, and then social welfare theory. A number of them they're there. I'm not getting into that. There is a pragmatic approach theory also. All of that is there. Now, constitutionally, culturally, and all of that, we have incorporated the idea of human rights into our legal documents and social process. They are also redressable in the court of law. So as far as our basic constitution is concerned, we have Article 14 to 32, all the fundamental rights that are there: right to equality, right to freedom, right against exploitation, freedom of religion, cultural and educational rights, right to constitutional remedies. All of that, that's been there. That's part of the declarations and all that. But if we look at the practitioners of human rights, or education of human rights as an understanding, I think comparatively we are less documented and less advanced. In a sense, we do not teach human rights as a separate branch. Postgraduate in human rights, it's rarely there. Rather we study it in political science, law, and many other branches. And the practice of human rights is largely concerned to the lawyers or the constitutional experts, or very often on the ground, number of NGOs that they try and rescue children or women or many other vulnerable segments. NGOs are active in the front to provide a protection or speak for these. So one of my concern has been that it involves people, and we have too many people. So naturally, we must take human rights issues as a separate branch of knowledge. Now, master's level education, good research, and all of that needs to be there because it focuses on people. It needs to be taught separately. And, but when mere teaching is not adequate. And that's where I will bring in Amartya Sen. Amartya Sen, 1990s, he got the Nobel Prize for his idea of what he called it as the freedom of choice. What we mean by freedom of choice is that if I want to educate my child, then I must have schools, colleges, and the facilities to educate. If I want to sell my product in the market, then there must be a market. I must be able to reach my product from my field to the market. There must be a road. If I want to live healthily, I need medical intervention. There must be medical facilities. He says, provide the facilities. Very often the government, the police, and all of that, they interpret everything. He says, government's role is minimal. And in a particular debate, I will examine that he says, very often we talk of GDP. If GDP rises, then the country is becoming rich, and then all your economic problems will be over. Rather, he changed the whole narrative, saying that that's not the right approach. Rather, you must invest on people, and if the people are enriched, your GDP will automatically go up. Invest on people. And that's where, from the economics point of view, Amartya Sen is the first one to talk of not human explosion. Rather, he talked of human capital. You must you must invest on your human capital and invest on them. If you invest on them, educate on them, provide them a road, provide them the necessary agricultural possibility and all that, they will become prosperous and all right, and GDP will automatically go up. Very often, therefore, it is critically linked that the economics is one of the critical variable towards maintenance of human rights in any given country. And that's why, as far as India is concerned, we are in a transition, and that's where now we have to look at empowering people. How do you empower? And that's where the education comes. Human rights education is necessary, but the first investment must have to be on education of most of us, our children and everybody. Last man in the corner in the Arunachal village has to be educated. More we educate, more we create conditions of, and that's where Amartya Sen's contribution leads to what you call Millennial Development Goal or Human Development Index. these modern terminology that we see is again Indian origin and concern, and rather a Pakistani economist was also involved in the whole debate. Mehboob ul Haq, economist who also worked with Amartya Sen, and they talked about. So in the conclusion, what we are, I would rather like to put it this way: that there's a great narrative, there are great many stories, but best of the stories do not get accommodated into the governmental policy process. We celebrate them, we tell them in many ways, but I think when it comes to the lady in the German border, giving shelter to the American soldiers and the German soldiers together, it's an exemplary story. Exemplary story. It doesn't happen every day. It's a fantastic story. Stories are there, but then it doesn't get, because there's an economic linkage also that is also there. And the economic linkage, in a sense, we have to consciously create state of investment on human beings in India, the man, not the prime minister, the chief minister, the cabinet ministers, the police, the Lal Batti, and the doctors, engineers, the human being, you, me, the neighborhood, the last man, all of that. I think that's where the very interesting thing that Kailash Satyarthi talked about when he received his Nobel Prize award. He says that all of us, everybody talks about children's rights, children, women, they're all the vulnerable society of human rights, and children of the large number of children in the world, they're out of school. Why? It's because they are too poor to be in school. The food too poor to be eating. They are hungry. And he says, very regrettably, lamentingly, he says that if at all world spends 1 week of world's defense expenditure on education of the children of the world, no child in the world will ever be outside school. He says, what is it what he wants? Just 1 week's world defense expenditure. Defense is for killing. We call it a security protection, but we kill others so that we feel protected. And for your information as to how much world spends on defense, annually, all of us, we put together somewhere between 1800 to 1900 billion dollar world spends on defense establishment. You're buying your weapons and all that. $1900 billion. Out of that, the Americans alone, they spend somewhere around $680 billion. The Chinese are the next largest, somewhere around 300 plus. Exact number, I don't know. India is somewhere around mid 60s, close to $70 billion and all that. We spend so much of money globally. We talk of human rights, both in United Nations. We celebrate Human Rights Day in a big way, write essays, narratives, and all of that. But we are not investing on human education. Instead, we are investing on defense instruments, which are not educating instruments. Rather, they are all neutralizing instruments. They're all killing instruments. They're all killing machines. Finally, I'll conclude with one very interesting story I read way back when I was a 7th grade student. At the peak of our freedom movement, Mahatma Gandhi was so popular, and one Jewish scholar, he was almost became Mahatma Gandhi's devotee. He wrote to Gandhi saying that, I'm so impressed. You have created a new model of peace, non-violence and all that. I'm so impressed. I'm impressed of India. I'm impressed of you. And I want to come and meet you. And also I want to convert myself to Hinduism. He had two desires: to come and meet Mahatma Gandhi and convert into Hinduism. Jewish scholar. And Mahatma Gandhi wrote to him saying that you're most welcome to come and meet me. I stay in Sabarmati Ashram, that's in Gujarat, and you are welcome anytime. My doors are always open. In fact, the doors were not there, so it is an open house. So you are always welcome. As far as your concern or interest to take Hinduism, adopt Hinduism is concerned, I am not greatly in favor of it. Rather, he says, if at all your religion is not giving you happiness, please be assured that no other religion in the world can give you happiness ever. Religions fundamentally are happiness instruments. We have created conversions out of it. We have created narratives or power politics out of it in such a way that instead of creating strength, it is creating weakness, it is creating vulnerability and all of that. Afghanistan, if at all Afghanistan is fighting war, all of us, we must be aware that Afghanistan is not fighting its own war. Afghanistan is not fighting its own war. Afghan people are not in conflict with anybody in this world. They have never been. They're fighting the Russian war. They're fighting the Pakistani war. They're fighting the American war. They're fighting everybody else war other than the Afghani nationals themselves. Those who have traveled to Kabul, Kandahar, Herat, and all of that, you will remember that culturally they have been transit posts. People have come through that, carried prosperity, trade, and they have created wealth. But it is the Russians entered into, and that's why the Americans wanted the Pakistanis to be militarized, Taliban and all of that. So the Americans funded Pakistanis to create a anti-Soviet Union collaboration against the Soviets in Afghanistan, and that's why the whole narrative starts in late 70s. And today, or for continuously, Afghanistan is burning, not because Afghanistans are wanting to war with each other. They are vulnerable, that every foreigner comes there and fights, kills, and then tells that we want peace in Afghanistan. That's a wonderful narrative. And the Taliban, as Taliban rises, the city they capture, one thing they're openly talking about is that whoever government officials and police and all of them, they capture the cities, they demand that all the women of these officers, government officers, police, and all of them, they be surrendered to the Talibanis for marriage. You can imagine we are 21st century, talking lots, but Taliban, a small, tiny local gun kind of a phenomena, and they openly declare that all the women of the government officials and the police and all of them, soldiers, Afghanistan, whoever is being captured, their women and children are being surrendered to them for sexual purpose. Syria is another example. Boko Haram, if you look at it, they kidnapped 250 girls, young girls. World could not save them. So the narrative is fantastic, but I think what we see in practice is something far too different, and that's where I I don't know I'm in favor or against, but I think we have to go much beyond the narrative itself. Thank you very much for inviting me. It was wonderful sharing my ideas with you. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you very much, sir. It was an excellent presentation. You made us float from our residence towards the entire world through this particular virtual platform, sir. Really, it was really an excellent presentation. And now may I request the participants to place their observations before sir, if they have got any, and let me check if there are any observations or questions related in the chat box. So here is an observation from Mayuri Sharma. There are gross violations of human rights at various levels, especially the issues of domestic violence and dowry deaths.